If we will take a look at the implementation of the load state function, it feels like this function is doing too many things. Actually, we can split the whole logic of this function by 3 parts. First of all, we're loading the state of the application from local storage. On the next step, we're initializing reactive variable activities with the data received from local storage. And the remaining part of this function is also doing initialization, but of timeline items reactive variable, so we can clearly see 3 different responsibilities, so to say. So now let's make it more obvious what is going on in this function by extracting some parts into its own functions. So the 3 things this function is doing is loading the state from local storage, initializing activities, and initializing timeline items. And now let's start from the first step. I'm going to declare a new function, load from local storage, and also declare new functions to initialize activities as well as initialize timeline items. And both of these functions are going to receive the state as the first parameter. Let's start with the first function. Down here, let's create this function. And then I'll take those 2 lines from the load state function and put them into this function. And at the same time, we can also try to inline serialized state variable. So instead of creating new variable, let's directly use the result of this expression and pass it to parse function. But in case there won't be any state inside the local storage, this expression will result to null. So in this case, to avoid any errors, we're gonna fall back to an empty object like this. Because if we're going to pass null to parse function, it is going to cause an exception. And this way we can get rid of this variable serialized state. And just because this function is a private one, it is not used anywhere but inside the same module, we don't need to export it. So the first step is done. Now let's switch over to the second one. Let's create function initialize activities inside activities module. I'm also going to cut implementation for this function, that is this line of assignment to activities reactive variable. And now inside activities module, right here, we're going to create the function initialize activities, which will get the state. And inside we can do all necessary actions to properly initialize activities reactive variable. Just in case there won't be any saved state inside local storage, we will fall back to an empty array. So next we're going to do pretty much the same steps, but for initialize timeline items function. From here, let's cut this implementation, go to timeline items module, and right here, export new function with the name initialize timeline items, which is also going to take the state. And just because this function references sync idle seconds function, which is defined inside storage module, we also have to move this function inside timeline items module. As we can see, this function calls another function calculate idle seconds. So let's take these 2 functions, cut them from here and move inside timeline items module. And now we're going to import all necessary parts that are used in both of these functions. Next, let's scroll up to the declaration of timeline items reactive variable, and instead of assigning default timeline item objects to this variable, we're gonna initialize this variable with an empty array first. And then, while we are calling initialize timeline items function, right here, in case there will not be any saved state inside local storage, we're going to generate default set of timeline items objects by calling generate timeline items function like this. So let's take a look at the load state function once again. Firstly, let's remove all the comments. And as we can see, this function is much more clear right now. It is clear to see that this function is firstly loading the state from local storage and then initializes a couple of resources. And the code responsible for initialization of each of these resources is actually contained within corresponding modules, activities, and timeline items. And by the way, both functions, load state as well as save state, are not used outside of this module. Let's make them private by removing export keyword. Just a side note, load state and save state functions are only used in the universal function sync state. As we can see, there are a couple of imports that are grayed out. Those are unused. We can safely remove those. So in this lesson, we have created initialization functions for a couple of resources, for activities resource, as well as timeline items, and both of these functions are contained inside corresponding modules. And all the extra logic that is needed to be executed during the initialization process can be safely encapsulated in these functions. So after doing all those refactoring steps, let's see if our application is still functioning properly. We do not see any errors so far. Looks like everything is good. We can continue development in the next lesson.